Hello, and welcome back to The Canadians. I'm your host, Jared Michael. Here at The Canadians, we attempt to understand Canada's contrarians. We believe contrarians are sometimes the only people holding valuable information the rest of society desperately needs. My guest today is Aaron Peat. Aaron is a current First Nations chief, a law graduate, and the host of the Nuanced podcast. Through hundreds of conversations with people from across the political, cultural, and ideological spectrum, Aaron has developed a reputation as someone who approaches disagreement with curiosity rather than certainty. That quality stood out to me from the first time I encountered his work. In a cultural moment that often rewards outrage, tribal loyalty, and the sorting of people into opposing camps, Aaron has chosen a different path. He has made a habit of sitting down with people he disagrees with, hearing them out, and treating them with the same dignity and respect he would offer anyone else. I wanted to come to understand where that instinct comes from. We begin our conversation by exploring Aaron's own story, the experiences that shape the way he thinks, and what he has learned from hosting hundreds of long-form conversations. From there, we turn to reconciliation, Indigenous governance, economic development, land and title, and challenges facing Indigenous communities today. Along the way, we discuss the difference between economic and land-based approaches to reconciliation, whether some of the tensions we see in modern societies are cultural or problems of scale, and why Aaron believes discussions about Indigenous policy should ultimately be judged by the outcomes they produce for the people they are intended to serve. Throughout our conversation, Aaron returns to a simple but important question. Are we helping communities become healthier, stronger, and more prosperous? This was a shorter conversation than usual, but I think we still managed to cover a surprising amount of ground. Without further ado, Aaron Peat. Aaron Peat, welcome to the Canadians.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you having me on the show here. Yeah, just, first off, I just want to say, just have so much respect for what you've built with Nuanced. I think it's really rare in Canada, I don't have to tell you this, to find places where you can hear a diverse set of views presented in a way where the host is respecting everybody involved. And so I really appreciate what you've done there. I feel like I come from a generation older than you. I'm like 51 here. And so, I grew up a bit on the left, and I feel that, growing up anywhere like left of center back in the 80s, 90s, you're kind of a fierce defender of freedom of speech. Like, you just almost couldn't be on the left without believing in freedom of speech. You prided yourself in kind of how many offensive arguments you could take in and still think. And so I feel like I come upon this way of thinking kind of on, it was the waters I was swimming in, and I've just refused to kind of let it go because I still feel there's a lot of benefit to thinking this way. Whereas you kind of came up in very different cultural waters at the time, when you were coming up. And I'm just curious how you developed your mind and your way of thinking, whether it was something you just naturally have a disposition that is skeptical and wants to look at all, avenues before you kind of make an opinion, or was it something kind of forged out of the, necessity as the mother of invention? You're trying to keep communities, families together, or something like that. I was just wondering if you have an origin story to your way of thinking, of being such an open-minded listener and thinker.
It's a tremendous question, and I think people should reflect more on the generation they come from and kind of the gifts and the challenges they were given. And I guess I would start by saying, I think I ran off of a lot of the feelings of your generation. Like, I do come from the 90s, and so a lot of those values were still there. I think over the 2005 probably to now is when that change took place. And so I do remember that time and understand the importance of those pieces. But I agree with you. They faded away over my generation. And so I hope that I'm the reflection that, like, we still have a little bit of that left. And then the other piece I would say is I did take Jordan Peterson personality test, and it rated me in the 99th percentile for disagreeableness. So I love disagreeing. I love having my viewpoints challenged. I love watching debates. Like, I really enjoy Piers Morgan, and I know people think it's a food fight, but sometimes it's really insightful dialogue on the most complicated issues, and he's good at getting both sides, the strongest arguments from both sides, kind of going at each other. And I think that's really important. So if you tell me the sky is blue, usually I'll say something along the lines of, like, that's just a reflection of the ozone layer and the water off of it, and so it's not actually blue. Like, instincts to disagree. If people say the sun is yellow, I'll remind them that it's not, that it's a white color, which is why our snow is. So those types of things have always fascinated me, and being able to hear from both sides and steelman different positions. That's one of my favorite words of all time. Taking the other side and giving the best possible interpretation. And I find what I see most of is straw manning, taking the weakest version of somebody. So I just enjoy creating that space, and it's just been something I've cared about since I was very young.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. And so what have you found? Like I found, I've been having these conversations with people and I've only had like 17, 18 conversations. And I've been surprised actually the impact each conversation has had on me, like how much I'm actually taking away, learning, changing my viewpoint, the way of thinking. And I see you've at this point are measuring your conversations in the hundreds. Like, have you felt that it's been a measurable effect? Can you speak at all to like, has there been an impact on just speaking to that many diverse people?
Absolutely. I think so. I think you have a unique approach that I didn't start with. I started hearing from people who I just found inspiring and learned a lot from. And I was just kind of putting in my 10,000 hours. And so during that period, it was more just hearing how people made a difference and how they grew into themselves and stuff. And now I get to hear from viewpoints I don't agree with and to challenge or get to see how they arrived at conclusions. And so I think that's really important, humbling to see that like you can disagree with somebody strongly, but they come to their positions really honestly. And I think that's the importance of all of this is I think it's easy to decide that you're not on or disagree just vehemently and not hear how they got there. And I have a lot of respect for people who develop their philosophies and who believe what they believe honestly. And we may disagree, but I think it's important to hold space for people like that. So I've learned a ton through this. And now I think I'm at the point where I really want to focus on the debate piece and having the two ideas really go head to head against each other in a respectful way.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll use that as an entry point. I did listen to your Tim Thielmann debate you had with about reconciliation, and you mentioned steelman earlier, and I love that term as well. The steelman's straw man. Are you familiar with starman?
No.
All right, well, starman is another concept, and I noticed you and Tim Thielmann did it at the very beginning of the debate, and that's just acknowledging right out the bat that you guys have good faith. You're both in here with good intentions, that you're arguing over how to get to good outcomes. And so the starman is the idea of just acknowledging right out the bat that you're arguing over how to get to good outcomes. It's kind of a good faith that you're starting from that place. And so yeah, it was an interesting debate that you guys had. I was wondering because the whole debate was on reconciliation and it was kind of a very broad term there. And I've often hear economic reconciliation versus land and title reconciliation. Like would you be able to quickly define those two things? And how much overlap is there between those two?
That's a really good question. So economic reconciliation is pretty easy to define. It's the idea that First Nations gets to participate in the economic development of the projects going within their traditional territory. And that should result in education opportunities, employment opportunities, and gainful income for the community, rather than just focusing on what you also described, which is land and title reconciliation, which is the idea that we're going to get land back through treaties, through reconciliation agreements, through specific claims. And the flaw in the latter is that it isn't clear that everyday members end up in a better circumstance, or First Nations people in general end up in a better situation. So you can imagine if you got 100 more acres of land, it doesn't mean that I'm going to develop that. It doesn't mean that we're going to bear fruit from that land, but now it's in our name. Whereas economic reconciliation takes an opportunity like the Enbridge Sunrise Expansion Project, which my community is participating in, and it's creating education opportunities, economic opportunities for our members, and job opportunities. And so that piece means that we're participating in the economic opportunities, which I don't think we historically did. And I think that economic reconciliation and I think is a useful idea, even if you go broader, because I remember when the TMX pipeline came through the lower mainland, everyday British Columbians didn't really get to benefit from it. Yes, the businesses like Subway and McDonald's and hotels, they did better and their owners did better. But those people doing those jobs did not economically benefit from those. And the people who live near the pipeline didn't benefit from those as much. And so I do think it's a useful idea. Like if we're going to agree to a pipeline, shouldn't the primary beneficiaries or the people we respect most are the ones who are directly impacted by those results. I think that logically follows from my perspective. And so those are the two differences. The Conservatives are much stronger on economic reconciliation. The NDP is much more focused on land and title reconciliation. And to be honest with you, I think for me personally, they both miss a bit of the mark, because all I care about is First Nations people rising out of poverty. And so economic reconciliation plays that role for sure. But there are pieces like housing and childcare that economic reconciliation would miss. And that would be one of my concerns. Through the NDP's government, he did what was called the Indigenous Housing Support Program, which was BC Housing funding housing on reserve. The first time in Canadian history that a province has done work on reserve and to housing. That's bringing 31 new units, 103 new beds to our community, and it's going to bring members home. It's going to take members off of the streets in vulnerable areas, working down the east side, and result in us being able to provide that community to members and hopefully make sure they don't get addicted to drugs and alcohol and stuff like that. And so I view that as the missing link between those two works.
Interesting. Okay. And so is there is there methods right out the door that kind of go in different directions if your practice, is there philosophies essentially attached to each of these two that why is it that Conservatives are more drawn to economic reconciliation, NDP is drawn more to land and title? Is there not very much overlap between these two then?
I don't see a lot of philosophical overlap between the two. There are definitely two camps, and you're correct. There's a philosophical difference, which is that many First Nations leaders argue Canada and British Columbia specifically is unceded, which means we did not agree to give up our land and title rights in regards to hunting, fishing, living on the land where we were able to travel. We never agreed in any agreement or anything to remove those rights. And so the NDP's perspective is, okay, we'll return some of that rights and title to you so that you can govern yourselves. The Conservatives, particularly in this leadership race, are very focused on repealing DRIPA and not going down this path where First Nations end up with more land. I think both arguments fall a bit short. One, the focus on lands and title doesn't improve necessarily First Nations individual lives or circumstances. It's driven by chiefs and council like myself. And we can use that land for whatever we deem appropriate, and different communities are going to have different focuses. The second, the flaw in the perspective is that it really just doesn't resolve this historic disconnect. And there is land available to resolve a lot of these issues. So one of the ones that I bring up fairly regularly is this idea of anticipatory reserves. When the reserve system was being created, the previous leader, Douglas, was talking about anticipatory reserves. He thought these communities are going to grow, they're going to need bigger reserves. Then an individual governor trust came in, and he said, no, all these First Nations people are going to die. They're not even going to be here. So we can downsize those reserves. And in some cases, he downsized them 90%. And so the reserves we live on today are much smaller than what we had agreed to with the former governor. And that's why we're in some of this dispute. So some communities want to see it expanded mildly, and some want their whole traditional territory back. And there's a spectrum of viewpoints on which paths.
I see. Okay, yeah. I could see another one of the places where you and Tim were kind of disagreeing on, I think, I don't know if it's said outright, but it's just, again, going back to my generation and the way we were raised and the way we approached Indigenous issues. Even, let's say, when I grew up, the word First Nation didn't even exist. And, and so that's a new moniker that got brought on. And with that came the language of nation to nation. And that's kind of newer to my way of thinking. And, traditionally, when we were looking at these problems and trying to figure out a way to solve them, it was, and I noticed you used this language when you were introducing the debate. You said all Canadians, all British Columbians. And, it was the idea that we're all Canadians, we're all one country. We're going to try to take care of, the idea is that we want to take care of any community struggling and, if we want to be judged as a country and how we're taking care of the most marginalized and the most vulnerable. And so the idea was, and so I think that's the argument Tim was making more, was for the idea of this equality. That's what, but we now have equity everywhere, which is a new concept too, which focuses more on this group identity, group membership. And, do you see that as a necessary step, that we have to kind of fall back onto racial lines, ethnic lines in order to solve these problems, that we can't we're not going to be able to accomplish this is using equal treatment for everyone?
So I guess I would start by saying that we are handed an absolute mess on this. Like nothing makes any sense. Things are contradictory within these files. And so I'm doing my best to be pragmatic in what I'm being given. And so I understand Tim's goal, like his long-term goal. But like that's just not what we're being handed today. And I don't see it likely that the community is going to get on board with his approach today. So I really am arguing from the standpoint of where are we today and what is the path forward. I view First Nation communities much more as municipal governments than anything else, than a federal body or a provincial body. So within your local municipality, they deal with roads, drainage, sewer, water, social services, social programs, building pools and building outdoor amenities. That's been my focus and what we've been delivering on: new housing, new water systems, new sewage systems, places where First Nation people can afford to live. Now, again, I didn't develop the system. Tim didn't develop the system. The system has existed for 150 years. And so I understand his argument of like, hey, why are we doing this? But First Nations, again, to your point about like the name changes, we didn't drive any of this. We didn't ask for this approach. We didn't say this was the best approach. We didn't say we prefer this. This is what the approach we were given. We have these reserves today that exist today, and we have social programs we need to deliver to community members. And so I just view it as like I'm open to the idea of changing these systems and moving towards something else. But he has not sifted through his idea of how we get there. And it takes a lot of buy-in from a lot of different communities and organizations and philosophies in order to get where he wants to get. Today, that's not where we are. So I say, let's proceed with this process. Let's continue to treat First Nations as municipalities. They don't get a veto in my diagnosis. Municipalities don't get a veto, but you recognize that they are a level of government elected by their community members or by the members, and that they do have a rightful place in sharing the perspective of their community. And so that's the balance I think is the path forward. I just think it's very easy to say equality across the board. How do you deal with the Indian Act? How do you deal with DRIPA? How do you deal with some of these reconciliation agreements? How do you deal with treaties? How do you, like, it's so easy to say, but I think it lacks some meat on the bone.
It could be why it has run out of steam as well, because we've had these problems since the formation of Canada. Like, even with the French, there hasn't been equal treatment across the board ever in Canada, really. We've had to measure this away. So I get where you're going, but it sounds like you're actually then, so you speak though, like, that does seem a little closer to Tim's argument, though, the idea of thinking this as municipal communities. It is just like, if we have a struggling community, we want to help out, we want to bring resources there. So how contrarian is your argument amongst your own communities and other First Nations leaders? Are they still like using the language? How often does the language of nation come up versus we're just a municipality?
So yes, there's a wide spectrum, and the loudest voices in the room would not agree with me. But the reality of what I'm suggesting and the path forward I'm proposing is what members would want.
Oh,
and that's why I feel the most comfortable in the camp that I'm in, is because I think we've, as a country, focused so much on the divisions between First Nations and the West that we both missed the point. Historically, I think the West missed the point that, yes, we had slaves. Yes, we had imperfect systems. Yes, we had bankruptcy where you could own people at the end of. We were an imperfect society, not arguing that we were perfect. But the West wasn't perfect either. They have flaws. I have multiple examples. How seniors were treated in the West during COVID was abysmal. Like, I have examples of how you treat the land in a capitalistic system is imperfect. And I'm not saying that we all need to shut down and start driving green energy cars, but the cost of destroying the planet is not accounted for in market systems. And so how do we balance that? I'm not saying that's a carbon. So I'm not saying that all of these ideas that have been forward are correct, but the diagnosis that it's an imperfect system, I think, is accurate. And so how do we find that balance? How do we work together to address these issues? I think that's what most First Nations community members would want. But there's a glory that comes with giving out land, right? Like there's a sense that you did something, that you accomplished something big. So you get 100 acres back. And that's what you're up against, is that's a gold medal in First Nation communities. I fought the government and I got this land. It makes you feel very proud. And then you look at, and this is no disrespect to them, but like you look at Tawasin, they got a bunch of land back through a treaty, and then they built a mall, which was fantastic. And now, from my understanding, that mall is being owned by China, like and Chinese entrepreneurs. And that's not, I don't hate China, but like we know that the Chinese Communist Party plays a role in our elections and is not always 100% trustworthy, and we have to be concerned about this. And so, if all we're going to do is ask for all of this land back and then just deal like a business, then what was the point in doing all of that? Like, what was the benefit to the members in their everyday lives? And I think if you have those conversations, you end up in a very different place. The challenge, of course, is that so many members are on social development. They rely on supports from the government, and they're afraid for any of those things to be taken away or changed because it's not clear that things are going to be better. And I understand, again, Tim's argument about wanting legal equality, but then how do you deal with rural, remote communities that have lived there for thousands of years? They just need to pack up and leave because we're not going to give them anything extra, even though that's where they came from, and the West has changed their way of life. The other one I see is this argument about, and I wanted to interview Caroline Elliott to understand, like, okay, so you don't think, I see this as like a logical argument. First Nations say, we're from this land, our ancestors are from this land, we grew up on this land, we've gone harvesting and picked berries up these mountains for thousands of years. We would like some time for ourselves to be able to go and hunt. We already have this with fishing. Like First Nations have fishing openings for us to serve our community and practice our traditional teachings independently of commercial fishermen. We'd like the same for going up Joffrey Lake and connecting with the land. That doesn't sound evil. That doesn't sound like malintent. It doesn't sound like we hate British Columbia, but you can certainly frame it as, wow, British Columbians don't get to go, but all these First Nations people, yeah, they have roots there for 10,000 years. There's lots of areas around the world where the Indigenous population, whether it's in Jerusalem or other places, where the people who have direct links or direct ties have a right to access that at a different time than the rest of the population. I don't think that that's hateful. I don't think that's bigoted. I don't think it's perfect. But I can certainly see the argument that they're making for it. And I also understand that doesn't play well right now in the political climate. Did I answer the question? I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, no, you got there. Yeah, you got there. I can see exactly what you're saying about so many of those things there and access to land. It sounds like, you could call that compromise in another, of just respectful neighboring, of like just recognizing that we all have different relations to the land and different cultural practices, and that, the average Anglo-European settler probably doesn't have the same connection to Joffrey's Lakes as, these communities do. So that makes sense. I wonder if we could discuss, you mentioned you like kind of getting into a little bit of disagreement here. And there's one thing I kind of find that, and I'm wondering if, I'm not saying you're thinking like this, but like you did mention that just, the Western culture exploiting nature. And I do find often, I tend to look at North American history not crazily different than from European history, in the sense that I just feel there's no oral history. There wasn't any written history left behind in North America, so we don't get to document it the same way we can look back. But I tend to look at human beings as human beings first, and, not these ethnic divisions. And when I look at the history of North America, I see very similar warfare, fighting tribes, migration. Even if we look at the way the Lakota, we can see the way they came into their traditional territory now, and it wasn't very peacefully, And so, I don't know if they're supposed to be doing land acknowledgements where they're standing now to, make up for anyways, we won't get into that. But I find often what happens is people will compare like the Nootka Nation to like Britain. And I feel like there's often a difficulty of scale occurring here, where it's like comparing small communities to Western civilizations, where I feel like the more honest and accurate way, if you want to compare, First Nations to England, I feel like we have to look at like the Mississippi Valley and Cahokia, or we have to look at the Inca or the Aztec or the Mayan and see what happened. Because I see these as problems of scale that kind of show up across history, no matter what color of the skin the humans have. It seems that we kind of do okay when we're in small communities. But the moment we start getting up to that city state size and starting getting to the point where you don't know everybody in your community anymore, you're not connected to everybody. It seems that's when, and it seems like if you look at the Aztec, you look at these other first, even in the Mississippi Valley, most people don't know there's a major civilization that sprouted up there, before contact. And it had massive income inequality. It had a royal family ruling. It had a peasant class dying, like living off of just cheap corn we can see this from the skeleton record. And so I see I feel like it's not necessarily accurate to say that, all the indigenous people of North America were just naturally in tune with, the rhythms of the earth. I think, people in small communities naturally have to be in the rhythm, whether you're Hutterite or whether you're First Nations. But it seems that every peoples across the world, once they get up to big populations, struggle. And it doesn't seem like the First Nations of North and South America were any different in that department.
That's an interesting point. I would agree with you. I'd also just point out, like at a core level, I think the challenge with Indigenous culture, I see a bit of similarity with Jewish culture as well, where you can be a Jewish person and you can be non-practicing, but that doesn't make you not Jewish, right? You cannot be religious and still be Jewish. You can be Indigenous and not practice a lot of these things, a lot of the cultural piece. And so I'd say I put the value system around the environment being more in the cultural piece. And to your point, like you would say, any society that developed with Christian values, lots of people are from that society that don't practice those values. You wouldn't say that they perfectly emulate their values all the time. And so saying can be said for any culture. You have these people, once they get to a certain scale, they may be closer to their culture or farther away from their culture at any given time. But I'll just give you one example. Right? They use it a fair bit because I think it places the culture piece in a unique circumstance. And I'll juxtapose this with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution. This is the origin story for First Nations people of the Sta'alis, which is right near my community. Before the world was here, the sun and the moon fell in love. They sent their emotions and feelings towards each other, and where those feelings met was the world was created. In the beginning, the world was covered with water, and over time and through evolution, some beings took shape and form. Some became the winged, some became the four-legged bearing, some became the plant people and the root people, some became the ones that swim in the rivers and oceans, and some became humans. Early in time, the humans were the weakest and needed the most help to survive. All our relations felt sorry for us. They took pity on us, and an agreement was made that they would sacrifice themselves through food, shelter, clothing, utensils, and medicine. The only thing they asked for was to be respected, remembered, only take what we needed, share those with less fortunate, to not gather during certain times to allow them to reproduce. And that is why we say all our relations. And so at the core of that, I see a recognition that we are imperfect, which you'll find in Christian doctrine, that we rely on other things, which I don't see as much in Christian doctrine, and that we need to be thankful and grateful, which you also see in Christian doctrine of praying before you eat. And so there are hints of it within the Western culture. And I would say, like the Western culture, when I say that, I mean Judeo-Christian ethics that come from those belief systems. You see hints of them, but lots of people, just to your point about Indigenous people going to war, lots of people who are Christian stop praying at dinner or stop remembering why. And even when I grew up a Catholic, we were not talking about how the animals in life died for us to be fed and have nutrients. The prayer that you say before dinner is not the same. And so I think you're right that you can have more connection or be farther away from the aims of your culture. But I just don't see some of those pieces within the Western culture. And those are the pieces I think can be changed through dialogue with Indigenous culture. I'm not saying just take everything of Indigenous culture and supplant it in the West. I'm saying find these pieces where it's the best of both and rise them up. I believe elections from the West should be supplanted and put into First Nation community. I think that's a better model than the model we had of hereditary chiefs. That doesn't mean I take the worst aspects of the Western culture of wanting to get as far away from your family as possible and go live your life separate. Like, I don't think that's perfect. And so you just have to be judicious in what you.
Okay. Maybe I'll just try, I'll be respectful of your time here. I'll just try one last idea. I was just talking to my dad the other day, and he did some work in Oregon in the past, and he was talking about this idea of I think they have the Oregon report card where they just go through and look at a bunch of metrics. And I wonder, do we get too hung up on processes, economic reconciliation versus land and title? Like, is there a way we can maybe approach this more as like you say, the concerns of the community, the concerns of your membership, looking at actual metrics that aren't necessarily captured, like you say, by market values and things like that, where you can capture, things that can be captured, like jobs, incomes, but also things like you say, like more untangible things like, family and quality of life and, the issues you're facing in the communities. Is there anything going on right now where we kind of can just grade those things and see how they're doing year to year and use that as a guidepost? And it doesn't matter what techniques we use to move that metric, as long as the metrics are moving and making the outcomes, like, just, is there a way we're measuring those things in a way that we can be more actionable about them?
I don't think so. And I have been a huge proponent of the need for that. So I worked as a Native court worker for 5 years. And what that meant was I was helping First Nations and Indigenous people through the legal system, helping them get connected to treatment, housing, employment opportunities, education resources, and trying to show the court they're on a different path. But I was the first to say this should be provided to every person who cannot afford their own lawyer, because there's lots of people who just fell into a bad way and ended up in a life that they didn't. Nobody as a kid thinks I'm going to become a drug addicted homeless person. And so all of these people deserve our support and understanding and kindness and investment in resources. And I think so much of what Tim and what you're describing is we get lost on the demographic. And right now it's true. First Nation are overrepresented in low education rates, high addiction rates, high suicide rates, high abuse rates. And to people who are going to comment, that is because of other First Nation people, most predominantly, but you do have outliers like Robert Pickton, who really put that in the zeitgeist of society of how bad things can be for a certain demographic of society. And so I do think when we develop these resources, we should have a requirement of our government to look at what the statistic is, implement the policy for 2 years, watch the statistics on whether or not things get better or worse. If they don't change, you cancel the program. Right. And there's no negotiation. There's the challenge I see is the government gets our taxpaying dollars. They outsource that work by giving grants and funding to nonprofit societies. Those nonprofit societies have an investment in keeping their business running because they're employing people. And then you just end up in this system where all of them are always saying there's a higher need, there's a higher need, there's a higher need, we need to do more. And none of them are proving that they're actually improving the outcomes overall. All they have to do is show, we had 50 people stay at this homeless shelter last. And the government goes, okay, we'll give you more money. That's not actually fixing any problems. It's not improving things. For justice, like, it's a file I am very frustrated with, because now we have Gladue reports. We have Native court workers. We have Indigenous courts. We have Indigenous judges. We have Indigenous lawyers. We have Indigenous justice centers. We have Indigenous people working and elders working in the criminal justice system. None of these have improved the outcomes. In fact, over all of those policies, things have gotten worse. Right. And nobody cares. And nobody listens to me when I say these things aren't working, because it's very unpopular to complain about, because we're getting the funding coming our way. So why are we going to complain? I just think that's a terrible way to run government. I think it's a terrible way to treat people, because ultimately all of these people are not ending up with better outcomes and their lives aren't getting any better. And we're spending a lot of money doing nothing. And I think it's disrespectful to the taxpayer to have them pay for it. But I would say any model should just be based on who are the most vulnerable 10% society. Right now, that is First Nations people. But this model should be adaptable to whoever is in the bottom rung of our society, because our systems, our tax systems, our markets are not driven to support the most vulnerable. They never have been.
Okay, well, yeah. Well, thanks for all that, Aaron. And I know you've got stuff to do today, and so we can say goodbye now. And I just want to say, thank you again for everything, and thanks for coming on the Canadians today.
Thank you so much for hosting this. You asked phenomenal questions, so I think you have a lot of opportunities ahead of you to start to help to shape the conversation, because I think this is exactly what people are looking for. And I just really admire your approach, the amount of research you did prior to this. And I'm just really blown away by the amount of work you put in ahead of an interview. It really shows in the quality of conversation we were able to have today. And I think that's very important. People who are really paying attention and putting in the time and effort to understand the issues and to look at other examples. I hadn't really thought about the Lakota or other regions because you're right, I become Canadian centric and focused on, I didn't think about the scaling problem. I don't think First Nations community scale. And so, yeah, I just think you should be very proud of the platform you've developed.
Oh, well, thank you for those kind words, Aaron. I really appreciate it coming from you. Okay, well, we'll say goodbye to the audience now, and yeah, goodbye, everybody. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our donations page or subscribe and share with friends. The Canadians, working class roots, a free speech lens, Canadian contrarians.